Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Wake up, hoser. You're in the army now. You're not behind the plow. You'll never get rich digging a ditch. You're in the army now. Rise and shine, Private Swartz. Rise and shine. How dare you not get up when you're told to? We'll have you cleaning the latrine if you don't move your ass right now. And I mean now, Private Swartz.
Oh, well, sorry, Sergeant Bunko, but I was up really late on the front line watching for UFOs, just as I was told to. Well, this huge flying saucer came over and abducted one of the guys. We tried to hold him down, but the suction of the craft was too strong, and they got him. They just got him.
Ah, no excuse, Private. You're lucky they didn't take your sorry ass. Now drop your schlong and pick up your socks and get your butt moving. 1, 2, 3. You're in the army now. Well, I don't know if we'll ever take the place of Phil Silvers. Huh?
I don't think so.
But it's I don't know. So how you been out there in Jasper?
We've been not too bad. You know, we got the remnants of Hurricane Irma.
Is that right?
Come through, yeah. But by the time it got to us, it was just, it barely rained half an inch. I guess it spent all of its might. But the funny thing about it is that after it came through here, it took a dive back down to Texas and Louisiana, and then circled back around and got us again.
Boy, that was some storm. I've vacationed a number of times with my friend April and the Virgin Islands. Beautiful place, but I hear that really got the brunt of the storm. Coming through on its way to Key West, where I would go and visit Jim Mosley from time to time. I'm sure he's one of the ones that would not have evacuated, and I don't think he was much of a swimmer either.
Wow!
And anyway, it's going to take a long time to recoup from that, and I'm glad to say that I have heard from most of my Facebook friends, and they're okay. A little storm weary at this point, but they're going to make it through all of this, and even our business contacts down in Florida and Georgia seem to be perhaps mopping the floor, but getting everything back to normal, which
that is good.
Hear.
Yeah, that's good news.
But of course, we're not normal, are we?
No, not even close. And if you're listening to the show expecting normal, well, you're in for a surprise.
I would say so, because you're not going to find normal on Exploring the Bizarre, and if you do, you can come and fire us.
No, don't do that.
You could take that microphone right out of my hand. Yeah, try it, buddy. Hey, I don't want to get too much of an aggressive approach here.
No.
Although, what are we talking about tonight? We're talking about the military and the paranormal and UFOs, and it's going to be quite a fascinating show. You know, the things that happened, paranormal events during the various wars and conflicts and leading up to it and just after have always fascinated me. In fact, many years ago, I wrote letters to various military publications asking for people to, in the service, veterans and so forth, to send me their experiences. And I got a file full. And I have been planning to work on a book on the subject. Unfortunately, I can't find the file.
Oh, no.
I've got like 40 file drawers, and it's in here somewhere. And one of these days, I will come across it, and then we will have another book to pursue. But Tim, let us gather our gear and our rifles and our tanks and hit the road towards Damascus or somewhere.
Oh, no, not there.
Not there. Oh, okay. Anyway, enough of our barracks shenanigans.
Yeah.
And you've had a reprieve. You don't have to clean the latrine.
Oh, thank you.
And you can pull your socks up at your own pace.
I appreciate that, Sarge.
You bet. Sergeant Bunko here. And anyway, tell our listeners who we have with us this evening.
Oh, yeah. Well, we got a great show tonight because we have with us Jim Miles, who is the author of 7 books of the Civil War Explorers series, Civil War, as well as Civil War sites in Georgia, and also 2 books titled Weird Georgia. Now, 5 books were featured by the History Book Club, and he's been a historical advisor to several History Channel shows. And he's also written 7 books about Georgia ghosts, Civil War ghosts of North Georgia, Civil War ghosts of Atlanta, and the list just goes on. Now,
but he lives in Maine.
No, I don't think he lives in Maine.
That's the wrong book.
That's the wrong guy. Yeah,
I'm holding a copy of his latest book, which has a fascinating cover on it.
That's Mysteries of Georgia's Military Bases, Ghosts, UFOs, and Bigfoot.
Well, I think that's what we're going to concentrate, at least to begin with. But go ahead. We have a second guest.
Right. Well, tonight we have the return of Mac Maloney. Now, Mac is the author of numerous fiction series, including Wingman, one of my favorite series of books, by the way, Chopper Ops, Skyhawk, and Pirate Hunters. Now, he's also written 2 nonfiction books, UFOs in Wartime, What They Don't Want You to Know, and Beyond Area 51. So now, Mac started writing books in 1984, and he's been doing it full-time since 1987, and he's written over 30 books. Mac is also the host of the radio show, Mac Maloney's Military X-Files. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us tonight on Exploring the Bizarre.
Here we go. I want to bring in, I think, Jim, first of all, because he hasn't been on the program before, and we'll give him a, pardon the expression, a shot at this. Jim, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your how you got involved in the military aspect of this? I mean, I've seen most of your books seem to relate to. Are you a vet?
I'm not, but all my life I've lived near major Air Force bases, Strategic Air Command bases, SAC bases. So twice a day you heard this fleet of bombers out there warming up, taking off, and the old flight comes in and lands. And you try not to think that 2 miles from your school are several hundred nuclear weapons.
Oh, I would
and you
guess
also
so.
Think that, yeah. And you got to consider that you were also one of the USSR's biggest targets. When the Cold War was over, we discovered that the Russians had 2 airburst nukes targeted for us. And the prediction was that it would have killed half of us outright and the other half of us within a week or so.
Now where was this at the time that you were living?
I still live in Warner Robins, Georgia, which is home to Robins Air Force Base.
Okay, and so when did you take? I mean, what made you decide though to take pen to paper. And is your background of that of a journalist or a writer, or?
All my life, I've been a teacher and a writer.
Okay.
I majored in history and political science. I taught high school American history for 31 years. I've been writing since I was a kid. Those two things have always just come together for me. Teaching is writing, and writing is teaching.
And what was the first thing that you wrote as far as the paranormal and the military was concerned? And why did you pick that topic? I mean, if you were going to write about the military, there's certainly a lot of other aspects you could have written about.
I consider myself to be a Georgia expert. I read newspapers every day. I've read every book about Georgia, pretty much every magazine, every newspaper through the years. And I collect all types of odd information about Georgia. And since I've lived near Air Force bases all my life, I've paid particular attention when there's a report about one of Georgia's military bases.
Mm-hmm.
And the three primary types of weirdness at Georgia's military bases are UFOs, ghosts, and Bigfoot.
Well, you know, I would imagine UFOs and ghosts. The Bigfoot aspect kind of, I won't say stuns me or surprises me, because I did a segment of I think on the History Channel of mysteries in the national parks, and one of the part of the interview that I did was about Joshua Tree, and I think it was Edwards Air Force Base. We talked about this albino creature, a Bigfoot, for lack of a better name, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call him, that had been seen by some of the military guards, on the perimeter of the base through binoculars. So, I mean, I am aware that these things, that's in a hot, humid region, of course, in Southern California. But anyway, what kind of was there one particular? Let's say, let's start out with UFOs first. Was there one particular event that kind of got this going for you?
Yeah. When I was 13 years old, I was a Boy Scout here in Middle Georgia. Now, we had Robbins Air Force Base, a SAC base, and there's a second one in Albany called Turner Air Force Base. And to protect them against Russian attack in 1960, they started building 90 nuclear missile batteries. 2 of them for Warner Robins, 2 of them for Albany on Turner. And what they had there were 24 Nike Hercules missiles, and if Russian bombers were approaching, they would fire these things off. And they were equipped with either a 2-kiloton or a 10-kiloton bomb, and they were meant to be exploded in the atmosphere and destroy incoming enemy bombers. Now, right next door to one of these missile batteries is Camp Benjamin Hawkins. It's a Boy Scout camp. And when I was 13 years old, we had a camping trip. And the first night, we would always stay up all night around the campfire, just all the boys talking. And as we told stories and looked at the sky, I saw this brilliant orange light appear in the distance up in the sky. We were all watching it, and it just zigzagged back and forth very slowly, kept coming closer and closer to Earth, and finally disappeared from our view. It was obviously flying and an object, and we couldn't identify it. So it made me think UFOs are keeping an eye on these nuclear missile batteries. And a few years later, another Boy Scout in the same place, he and 2 other counselors were watching the skies one night, and this brilliant orb showed up and paralyzed them for a while. And then the UFO moved over the missile battery and disappeared. So that's what started it all, that event.
Yeah, considering all the Nike bases that were built around the United States. It surprises me that with all the UFO sightings as well, that somebody hadn't inadvertently launched one of those missiles at some of these incoming UFOs. Glad they didn't.
That's an interesting thought. I think there were several hundred of these batteries around the country, and it is miraculous nobody popped one off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they built a couple of them here in Indiana. One near Chicago, and then they had another one to protect the crane facility down here in southern Indiana. Well, Jim, I'm interested in just real quick about your Civil War books. Now, you've written a number of books, about the Civil War, but you've also included in there a lot of ghost stories that seem to swing in the same direction, so to speak, as as these Civil War books. I mean, are there more ghostly sightings in some of these areas that saw a lot of action during the Civil War than others that that you have discovered in researching your books?
Absolutely. One of the most haunted places in America is Chickamauga Battlefield in North Georgia. Now, Chickamauga was the second largest battle in the war, and there were thousands of men killed. And since the battle was over, people have been telling stories. One story, it might actually be a Bigfoot, but there's a creature that supposedly was crawling over the battlefield and picking up and carrying away dead bodies to feast upon. Some people think it's a real animal type.
That's a wild story. Now, when did this happen, and was it on more than one occasion?
Oh, many times. Yeah, old Green Eyes is what he's called, and visitors that stay there after dark see these two green eyes just pacing around, sometimes making noise. Sometimes you could smell it. Ooh. And people always feel threatened by it.
Now, can you describe it for us?
Basically, Bigfoot. It's a large, perhaps a ghoul is a better word for it. It's a humanoid. It's got long arms and legs, and it's fairly large. When people actually see the figure and not just the eyes, they are intimidated and they run away.
They are intimidated. I think I would be intimidated.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds like something taking opportunity for a free meal.
Yeah, could be. And that's just one of many different types of ghosts from Chickamauga.
Right.
There are women dressed in their wedding dresses wandering around trying to find their fiancé killed somewhere in the battle. Spectral soldiers are seen prowling through the woods, sometimes firing rifles at you, which will get your attention. There's just all manner of haunted material there at Chickamauga. Another place I'm sure everyone's heard of is called Andersonville. It was a federal prison started in southwest Georgia in 1864. They sent way too many prisoners down there. They had a limited and polluted water supply. Very little food could make it down there. And in about 9 months, 13,000 Union soldiers died at Andersonville. And they are all buried there in a national cemetery today. So if hauntings come from desperation and misery and hatred and just every negative human emotion, then that is the place that is going to be haunted the most.
So now when it comes to modern day military bases. And it's not just from you. I mean, I've heard these stories from other people as well. A majority of these bases seem to have their own not UFO haunting incidents. I mean, what is it about these bases that seem to be a focal point for ghost and hauntings?
Just about every military base is haunted or thought to be haunted by something. But in my experience here in Georgia, you have the most ghost cases from the Army bases and the ones that have been around the longest. For example, Fort Benning in Columbus is one of the largest military bases in the United States. It has trained hundreds of thousands of men and sent them to World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and the War on Terror. So men are constantly being trained there, and often their families are stationed with them there, and we send them off, and unfortunately they die. And it seems like many of them try to come back to the last home they had or the last peaceful place that they knew.
Now, Jim, how would you? Let's see. How can I put this? Do you think? How do you see the phenomenon itself? Do you think that these are the actual spirits that are coming back? I mean, the spirits of the deceased, or is it some sort of psychic impression that's been made on the atmosphere, and it's kind of like we're rerunning the events of the past today?
I think that most of these are spirits coming home. The standard story in Fort Benning, and sometimes you swear every house and apartment on the base is haunted. But the most common thing is people currently living in a place, they will hear the front screen door open. They'll hear the front door unlocked. They'll hear the door close and lock. They will hear boots, combat boots, walking across the wooden floors. And it seems like they're just coming home over and over again.
And do they actually make, though, any, let's see, communication or contact with the living, or is it? Would you say that they're all just pretty much phantoms of the night?
I would call them phantoms of the night. There's no communication attempts. There's lots of poltergeist activity, and things disappear. But rarely is there any.
Well, Jim, we're going to disappear for a minute because we're on our first break here, and we'll be right back with more of Exploring the Bizarre.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre right here on the mighty KCOR Digital Radio Network. And Tim, I think we need to bring Mac Maloney in. He's been waiting patiently. Yeah, he's been waiting patiently in the wings. So, Mac, it's your turn. Great to have you with us tonight.
Thanks, guys. Glad to be here.
Well, I just I wanted to point out really quick that Mac has, let's see, it was May of this year that you released book number 18 in the Wingman series.
Yep, that's right. Wingman 18 came out May 2nd.
May 2nd. Okay, so now, what's how long had it been between book 17 and book 18? I know it's been quite a while.
Right. Book 17 was more like a novella that came out 3 years ago, and then between book 16 and 17, it was about 12 years or so.
That's quite a wait.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you prefer writing nonfiction to fiction, or how do you decide what to work on next?
Well, it's fiction is much more preferable because you can make it all up. With nonfiction, you just got to do a lot of research and so on. And I can remember when I was in the middle of the first one, UFOs in Wartime, just looking around my office. I'm probably about halfway through the book. I'm late on the deadline, and I said, "Wow, how did I get myself into this?" With all the research that you have to do, and you have to double check everything. You have to vet stuff, and it's a lot more work to do a nonfiction book for sure.
Well, that was your publisher's idea, wasn't it, to do a nonfiction book?
Yeah, we were just out. I was out to lunch with my editor once, and we were just talking about UFOs just as during the conversation. And I had mentioned to him that I had always had this idea, not always, but I had this idea for quite a while that it seemed like more UFOs showed up during wartime than peacetime. And he said, "Hey, that sounds like a good book. You want to do that as your next book?" And so that's really how it started.
And so what do you, we know about UFOs over military bases and stuff like that, but is there a particular concept or area of research that you find most enlightening?
I like this whole, you mean overall, right?
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I like this idea. We talk about it on our show a lot. In that we call it the unified field theory of the paranormal, the idea that maybe UFOs and Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster and ghosts, it's all part of the same thing.
Yeah, well, that's like we have Paul Eno on from time to time.
Right, Paul is a really good friend of the show. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so he's kind of did a lot of groundbreaking research and work.
And we just seem to come upon more evidence of that as we go along. So I think that would be kind of cool if it turned out to be all part of the same thing.
Now, historically, how far do you go back in doing research?
Well, in UFOs in wartime, we went back to Alexander the Great, 300 BC, and up until the end of the 20th century. You can go to just about anywhere in history's timeline and find something having to do with UFOs. They've been around with us as long as we've been around, I think.
That would seem to be that way. Now, why the particular? Oh, okay. We can see today with the the advent of nuclear weapons and the A-bomb and all of that, why they would want to keep an eye on our tacky enough existence. But going back to Alexander the Great, or this long time ago, it wouldn't seem that we were a particular threat to their civilization. Is there some other reason that you could grasp that they are kind of leery or weary or concerned or observant?
Mm-hmm. I don't think they're really here to protect us, to keep us from blowing ourselves up. I know that that's a popular theory, but I don't really. When you look at, as once again, history's timeline, it looks more like they are there just looking in on us. And one of the theories that we put in UFOs in wartime is that this could be something as simple in quotes, as time travelers, time tourists, people coming from, sometime in the distant future, coming back here, finding the secret to time travel and coming back and just watching as history is being made.
Now, do you find that there's any evidence that time travel actually exists?
Well, if I knew that, I think I'd probably be out in Pasadena someplace, or at Langley or something. Let's look at it this way: if you had the ability to go back in time and be a time tourist, I mean, who wouldn't do it? I was talking to someone the other day, and they said, "Oh, I'd go and see a Shakespeare play," and someone else said, "Well, I would go see the crucifixion of Christ." And then, of course, you have that question: well, then why wouldn't there be 2 million people for a Shakespeare play? And that's one of these things that we can't figure out. But
well, they're all sitting in the balcony. That's
or
why.
Something, right. Overflow out in the parking lot. But there is a lot of evidence that, especially with the Foo Fighters in World War II, so many of them were seen by both sides, and during the war, we thought they were German super weapons, and they thought they were our super weapons. And only after the war did everyone realize that, they didn't belong to anyone on Earth. But there's no evidence at all that they shot at us or they shot at the Germans or the Japanese or whatever. They were there. Lots of people saw them, but they were just kind of observing, watching what was going on. And that's that whole idea of that, maybe they're just tourists, time tourists, seeing history as it's being made.
Hey, Mac, are you familiar with the stories that have gone around about Mussolini being having some UFO involvement? Apparently, there were some telegrams and some papers, documents, kind of like our MJ-12 papers here that were left to show some illustrations of these weird objects in the sky and so forth.
Boy, I've not heard that, but I know Mussolini was a weird dude, so it wouldn't surprise me if something like that showed up in his papers or whatever.
Well, we did. I'm just trying to. Tim, do you remember what book did we write this up? Was it the Nazi UFO time travelers, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, okay, but we also had. Oh, now I've lost my train of thought. We also had Churchill, I think, was quoted supposedly interested in UFOs. There were some sightings that I guess that were passed on to him, and he tried to cover it up.
Yeah, he was shown a picture that was taken by a Lancaster bomber, a reconnaissance bomber, of something following this airplane. And it was a very clear photograph, or a series of them. And he was shown these around 1944 or so. I think this is from UFOs in Wartime. And, and what he did was he said, we cannot let this out, because he was afraid that it would ruin all the religions in the world. He just thought, if there was evidence that there was someone else out there, what does that do with our earthbound religion? So he said, we cannot release these for 50 years. But then, as far as our research showed, the British Security Service just destroyed the photos, so they wouldn't even have to make that decision 50 years from now. But yeah, that we actually found a lot of evidence that Churchill did see pictures of, what they called Foo Fighters back then, and he just did not want them to be released to the public.
Mm-hmm. Now, I remember actually in that, I think it was the Nazi Time Traveler book, we actually had a reprinted illustration of the front page of one of the newspapers back during Mussolini's era, and it showed some military, in bunkers, and there was this strange object in the sky, and this was talking about going back to 1940 or something like that. So apparently, I mean, like you say, the UFOs have always seemed to have a keen interest in our ongoing battles. Now, do you see that it's increasing at all over the centuries, or pretty much a standard fare?
Well, because we have more information now, let's say in the 20th century, than back, going back to Alexander the Great's time, you hear about it more now, and I'm saying relatively speaking now in the past 100 years or so. But there are, there are newspaper articles from the Germany in the 1500s that show only be described as an air battle over.
Well, that's right. They were doing a little bit of their own fighting in the in the sky.
Right.
Well, now how about I saw a movie. It was a theatrical movie, but it was on like YouTube or something like that, an hour and a half, regular movie. But I don't think it ever played in the theater here. And it was about UFOs over Vietnam. It wasn't a documentary or anything. It was actual film, and they tied the gin into it in all. Now, how prevalent were sightings in Vietnam and the Korean conflict and so forth?
Well, there were a lot of UFOs seen during the Vietnam War, and there's been UFOs seen in Vietnam, over the years before the war, and I suppose after the war. But there's a famous story about how we had some of our fighters chasing UFOs over the DMZ in 1968, and they actually fired on these UFOs, and the missiles that the airplanes fired actually hit an Australian ship. and killed 3 sailors and also injured a lot of people. That's called the Hobart Incident. It's an Australian destroyer that was off the coast of Vietnam, just kind of got in the way of this fight between F-4 Phantoms and what they were calling enemy helicopters back then. But of course, the Viet Cong Vietnamese didn't really have helicopters. They were shooting at something. The missiles went astray, hit this Australian destroyer. Later on, officers from the 8th Air Force, had spoken at veterans dinners and things like that and said this actually really happened. There's stories about aliens being seen in the jungles of Vietnam. There's, of course, the story we don't have in the book, but there's a story that they found a B-52 in the middle of the jungle. They have no idea how it got there. Because it wasn't
kind of shades of the Bermuda Triangle,
something like that. Yeah. So, and it was a strange war too, because I hate to say it, but there was a lot of drug use going on. Who knows what was going on really? But Vietnam had a lot of sightings, and so did the Korean War. Korean War had lots of sightings.
Yeah. See that I've heard about the ones in Vietnam, but not so much about the Korean conflict. Can you give us a little background on that?
Well, the Korean conflict is actually really important to the whole stories of UFOs in the United States, because shortly before the Korean War started, the U.S. Air Force, at first after a study came out saying that these flying saucers were not from Earth, the Air Force says, well, that's not the answer we want. So they came up with another study saying that anyone seeing UFOs was either a religious fanatic or someone who had mental problems. And then 6 months later, we're in the middle of the Korean War. Now we're flying around in jet fighters that have their own radar on them. Plus you have radar on the ground, radar on ships, and these UFOs start showing up. They're triangulating them, let's say. You're seeing them from 3 different sources. And there were lots of them, and now the Air Force is in this position of saying, well, they can't say that all their pilots are religious fanatics or need, mental health, help. So that's what really spurred them on to start Operation Blue Book. Not that it did very much, but at least that was their way of saying, well, we have to kind of look into this because just so many pilots, and there was so much evidence, electronic evidence, that UFOs were flying over the Korean Peninsula during the entire war. It spurred them on to do something. So Korean War is very important in this whole kind of history of UFOs in the U.S.
I know you have one story in your book where the pilots came across several UFOs that were just absolutely tremendous in size, and they're just absolutely shocked by what they were seeing. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Right. There were 3 fighter bombers had taken off from an aircraft carrier in the Sea of Japan, and they were on, if there can be anything as a routine bombing mission, that's what they were doing. And just as they were approaching the target, these 2, fantastically enormous flying saucers came upon them. And I mean, I believe they were, half a mile in size, just, 2,500 feet maybe, in size, radius, and did maneuvers, aeronautical maneuvers that just didn't make any sense for something this large. They were basically flying rings around these 3 airplanes and
showing off
them, in a way, or intimidating them. Or who knows, what they were up to? But they were seen by the pilots. The pilots' communication to their aircraft carrier was cut off, but they were seen on radar from the aircraft carrier. The North Koreans must have seen them because it prevented them from getting bombed. They called off the bombing mission. And then they just disappeared so quickly. They moved out of the area so quickly. It was almost as if they had disappeared.
Going back to World War II. Now, I know that I think the last time that you were on a show, we talked a little bit about the legend of the Dirtlockland and things like that. I mean, what do you think about the whole idea of man-made flying disc, and the possibility that Nazi Germany may have been one of the first to actually work on and even start developing, this kind of technology.
Well, I don't believe at all that the Nazis had any kind of help from an alien race during World War II, and we go into that very extensively in UFOs in wartime, and we could fill an entire show on that. But the one thing that you have to remember is if they had alien help, if they had a base in Antarctica, if they had a base on the moon, and so on, why did they lose the war? So
well, they were spending all their time going to the moon and Antarctica. That's it.
I guess, but I do know that they had the first jet fighter, for instance, the Me-262, but they were so short on materials at that time that the cockpit of Me-262s was made of plywood because they just didn't have the steel and other metals to make a cockpit that would at least help the pilot have a chance of surviving something. A lot of these wonder weapons that you hear about, especially when people kind of make this Nazi alien connection, a lot of them were, there was only one or two of them made, and some of them didn't even get off the ground. And they were more desperation weapons than wonder weapons. The German engineers, they did get into some interesting stuff as far as putting together like jet bombers and rocket planes and things like that. But, that was also going on in the U.S. and the U.K. too. I mean, the U.S. and the U.K. developed jet engines and a jet fighter just about the same time that the Germans did. The fact is that the Germans were in a desperate situation, so they built a number of these things. Hitler made a mistake. He wanted them to be bombers. That saved us about a year and a half from having to deal with these things. But when we did deal with them, we did so with just such overwhelming force that it really didn't have any effect on the war. So they were, they're fantastic engineers, and they built some interesting airplanes. But this whole idea of alien help, I just don't believe it. And then, of course, a lot of those German scientists, Werner von Braun and hundreds of his colleagues came over here after World War II in Operation Paperclip, which I'm sure a lot of people know about, and they formed the foundation of NASA, and NASA put us on the moon. So one thing that is for sure is that Nazi scientists helped the U.S. go to the moon. That is a fact.
Well, they probably helped the Russians as well, though. I mean,
half of them, roughly half, went to Russia, to a place called Kapustin Yar. And they did help the Germans just like they were helping us. But, either whether we got the better scientists or whether we had more money to throw at it, but, we were the ones that went to the moon.
Yeah, I don't think the scientists who went to Kapustin Yar were very happy about it. I think probably the majority of them wish that they had ended up in the United States rather than the Soviet Union.
They didn't have a good time of it, that's for sure. Very few of them. Some of them were allowed to go back to Germany after a while, but not many of them.
Well, now how about some of this kind of strange technology that we hear that was being developed by the Nazis, the Glocke with the bell-shaped object, anti-gravity, electromagnetic.
There's nothing to that. There's nothing to any of that, because after World War II, there were special units that. In fact, we're going to have the grandson of someone who was in the OSS at the time, which was the precursor of the CIA. They sent out squads of American soldiers who also were kind of scientists and engineers to try to find anything that would be useful, for our military. And talk about jet engines and so on and so forth. But you believe me, if they came upon anything having to do with anti-gravitational technology or any of this stuff that you hear about, we would have it now, and we'd be using it just like we use their expertise to get on the moon.
Well, now we did do a program just a couple of weeks ago where we talked about the so-called secret space program and how there may be some unidentified craft that are floating by overhead that are being manufactured here on Earth.
Well, I see. I hate to be the bucket of cold water, but I don't believe any of that for this reason. If we had a secret space program and as big as some people, claim it is. Where's the logistics that would have to support something like that? Where's their version of Cape Canaveral? Who are the engineers that work for them? Where do you get the fuel? Where do you get the electronics? There would have to be thousands of people involved in this. And these days, as you know, no one can keep a secret. The guys who shot bin Laden and SEAL Team 6, who took an oath never to talk about that until they, past their dying day. They've written books. They were on Howard Stern, for God's sakes. Okay, you could not keep a secret space program secret in this country. You just couldn't do it. Someone would talk.
Well, but hasn't the government kept UFOs in general a secret?
Well, I don't believe that the government knows what UFOs are. I think that the government knows UFOs exist, and I think we all do, because there's so much evidence that there is something out there, that they do exist. I'm sure they have them on film. I'm sure, who knows what kind of evidence they have, but I don't believe that the U.S. military knows what they are. I think they're just as much in the dark about it as we are.
So you don't think that there's any little men in freezers somewhere, or that there's wreckage from UFOs?
No, because we would find out about it now. If they had the Roswell UFO and and that was back in the late 40s, they would have taken it apart by now. They would have reversed engineered it, you would assume, or and once again, it would leak out. You cannot keep a secret these days. You just cannot keep a secret. Someone would talk. Someone would go to 60 Minutes and make themselves $1 million saying this is a piece of a UFO. It hasn't happened. We don't see any evidence of reverse engineered stuff from UFOs or any kind of extraterrestrial craft. I just think it's as big a mystery to our government and governments around the world as it is to us.
And they just won't admit it, though. They won't admit.
Well, they don't want to admit it. Right.
Yeah, they can't go and say that. Hey, yeah, UFOs are real, but hell if we know what they are. Yeah,
that's right. Exactly. Exactly.
You talk about. Everyone talks about. Oh well, you reveal that aliens or UFOs exist, and that it would scare everyone. Well, it would scare them worse if they didn't know what was going on. Oh, I hear the music, Tim. So why don't we go to our break, and we'll come back and continue our conversation about the military and weird mysteries on Exploring the Bizarre.
Exploring the Bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe, exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Here we are in the second hour of Exploring the Bizarre, Tim. And tonight we're talking with Jim Miles and Mac Maloney. And I think I have a question for Jim concerning his most recent book, Mysteries of Georgia's Military Bases. And Jim, I have to say that I've thoroughly enjoyed this book. But I want to ask about the section about Fort Benning and Lawson Army Airfield. Man, it just seems like everything is going on there. I mean, you've got ghosts and hauntings and Bigfoots and UFOs and time slips. And, I'm surprised there isn't a vortex with, devils and pitchforks coming out of it as well. There's just, everything going on. What is it about that place that is just makes it such a hot spot of activity?
I think it's because of the size and the age of the facility. It's in size, it's about 2 Georgia counties. They have vast areas for training, and that's where Bigfoot shows up. You only find Bigfoot at Army bases. And there's a couple of those in Fort Benning, but mainly with Benning, it's ghosts and UFOs. All those men have gone off to fight. So many of them haven't come home. The ones that come home were often haunted by what happened to them. And while they're gone, their wives and children are waiting very anxiously. Just think of the book and the movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young, which focuses on the families as the word of death come in. So all of that anxiety, the mourning, everything just contributes to make it a special paranormal place.
Well, why don't you tell us some of your favorite ghost stories that you ran across while researching this book in the Fort Benning area?
Okay. In Fort Benning, there are people who start up sort of support groups because they have so many sightings there. And there have been women who have tried to go to the housing authorities and asking them, don't rent this place out. Don't put another family in here because we've had this experience. The lady before us told us that she had this experience there. One of the ones that made the most impact on me was a woman. She moved into this house, and it had paranormal activity. Now, sometimes when you have a situation like this, the spirit will single out one person for special attention. Mm-hmm. And this woman, when she was in the house for long periods of time, she would become very listless. She would go to the hospital and they say, your blood count is very, very low. We need to give you a transfusion. And this continued. And they did every test on the woman to see if there was a problem, to see where the blood might be going, but they could never find it. And when the family took a 2-week vacation back to their home in the north, she returned to normal health. And when she got back to a Fort Benning house, she got sick again. And she would spend as much time outdoors as she possibly could. And of course, during the fall and winter, she had to spend time indoors. And she just got sicker and sicker. Every test was performed on her. And never could find anything wrong with her. Finally, they finished their tour there, and they moved, I think, to a place in Kentucky. And a couple of weeks after that, her doctor said, "You're in perfect health."
Yeah. Just a toxic atmosphere.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, I have a question. How about as far as abductions? Any abductions going on any of these military bases in Georgia?
No, not abductions. The UFOs at the military bases seem to just be observing. The most dramatic UFO encounter came from Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, which is the airport for Fort Stewart. Mm-hmm. In the fall of 1973, there was an unprecedented number of UFO sightings across the entire base, across the entire state of Georgia. And on September 8, 1973, there were 2 MPs patrolling along Perimeter Road, and they saw a UFO very close up. And they thought, that's interesting. And so they went about their patrol. 10 minutes later, the UFO was back and dove at them. They said it barely missed the car, and as they ducked, they ran off the road and into a ditch. It took them 15 minutes to extricate the car, and all the while, the UFO was hovering 50 yards away as if it were watching them. It followed them back to headquarters and stayed there until they went inside, and then it flew away. Now, the MPs asked their superiors, how do we report this? They were told there is no form for UFOs anymore, so just write it up as an accident report. Oh, and they did. They were perfectly honest about the report. And then
What you say? They made him fill out they made him fill out an accident report.
Yes, an accident report.
Oh, okay.
Now this accident report started changing. First, one of the MPs said, "Well, we didn't actually get stuck in the ditch," and then a duty officer said, "Well, they didn't really leave the road either." And reporters wanted to talk to them, and they made appointments, but then they wouldn't keep them. And the base information officer said, "Well, there's been some changes here, but I can't tell you what it is." Finally, they said, "Okay, the MPs are available. You can talk to them." Reporters called. MPs had been sent on leave off base. And that was the end of it.
Well, you do relate in the book the story of John Vasquez. Am I pronouncing that right? Which I remember. Huh?
I believe that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah. Okay. I believe that I had some correspondence with him years ago when I was publishing the UFO Review newspaper that I put out for a while. But he had a close encounter.
More than a close encounter. That's one of the most bizarre stories I've ever come across.
Well, it is. Yeah. Can you capsize that for us?
Yeah. In 1977, John Vasquez was stationed at Fort Benning. He told a long story, which started coming back to him in 1984, I believe, and then he underwent hypnosis and recalled the whole story. That night in Fort Benning, a UFO attacked his unit, and men were running under the barracks and hiding, and UFOs went away. The men woke up the next morning, and they were disoriented, and their clothing was all disarranged. Then there came a long story about his unit going on a patrol, and somehow they became renegades. And there were soldiers chasing them with a tank and artillery. And he described actual fighting between his unit and other Army units.
No way.
And so he and his men
that part I hadn't heard.
Yeah. It's all in his book, Incident at Fort Benning. Then they hit the road, and he has them out there. They steal like 2 trucks, 4 Jeeps. They're locking people in closets. They're breaking into buildings. He swears there were no officers or sergeants around. They were just all by themselves. And they encounter a pond that they have to cross. And apparently there was a Loch Ness Monster type thing in that pond, which attacked them and injured one of the men. It's a bizarre story.
Now, do you give this any credibility?
I do not.
Okay, well, that's straightforward enough, yeah.
Now, the big story is, after all this is over, they're back in formation on another day, and a UFO arrives and attacks them. And it's spitting out little balls of light at the men, knocking them out. 2 different helicopters, Army helicopters, show up, and they're shot down. And they've got a tank firing at the UFO, and John Vasquez has himself leading all of these things. Okay, half the book almost are his documentation. He spent years writing hundreds of letters to everybody you can imagine, trying to get proof of his story.
Right.
His primary proof was he found there was a measles outbreak of 14 men, 2 helicopters needed superficial repairs, and there was an A-10 attack exercise at that time. He swore all of this was evidence of the attack, and he swears that when he didn't get any information, somehow that constituted documentation of his story.
I think he did find. I think he did find one other witness, or somebody that collaborated. Yeah.
He found 2 witnesses who originally were unnamed. They later became named. These 2 guys had known themselves since childhood, which to me ran up a red flag. And one of them died supposedly of cancer after a UFO hit him with a beam. And I don't find those stories valid as well. Mm-hmm. At the very end, he says, if I didn't have documentation here, you would think this was a contrived science fiction novel. First thing that hit my mind was that is a bad, contrived science fiction novel.
Well, one would almost wonder, though, why go to the extent of doing this? I mean, it's not like your book is going to become a bestseller and people are going to flock, to your door for more information. I mean, it would seem that there must have been something that sparked a belief. It could have been some sort of hallucination caused by. How about a government experiment? Perhaps we know that. The government was doing experiments with LSD back in the 50s.
He did suggest that was a possibility, but in his investigation, he was always trying to prove that there was physical evidence of an alien attack.
Yeah, and also too that they might have doused you, with the lucky sunshine and a purple haze once or twice, but it doesn't seem like they would be able to control an entire story like that, coming out. It would be a pretty loose ended if you're, have hallucinated something. I mean, I can't say that I've had too much experience with that, but I did one night trip out listening to Jimi Hendrix. I never did any mescaline or anything after that. I figured, well, this is the height of the experience, man. You're not going to get any better than this, But even then, you can tell. I would assume, at least I did, that it's a hallucination. You're sitting there and you're watching this, and you're saying the musical notes are not really coming out of the speakers. He's not really levitating 5 feet off the stage. I don't think.
But you knew that yes. you had taken something. Now,
yeah, well, I'm gonna blame it on Jim Moseley.
If you had soldiers that were dosed with something, they had no idea that they had been dosed. And I do know that there were MK Ultra experiments where they would dose soldiers and then put them outside and then shine bright lights, searchlights on them, in the dark, just to see what would happen with them. So, some of the aspects of the story sounds really similar to some of these earlier types of LSD experiments.
For sure. Now, Mac, have you done any investigation on the Rendlesham Forest? I mean, are you up to date, up to speed on that?
Yes. Yep. We've had Peter Robbins on a number of times, and we've talked about that with Paul Eno. That's an interesting case because there's, first of all, there's been a lot of stuff that is written about that tends to go to what Jim was talking about, how it's these things that just seem like flights of fancy more than actual incidents. That there are underground bases there and all this kind of stuff. But there's no doubt about what happened with Colonel Halt or Major Halt when he went into the forest, and because you can hear his voice on the tape recorder basically telling you what he's seeing. There were a lot of people, a number of witnesses who saw what happened there those 2 nights. But it's a very strange part of England, too, because not only were these 2 bases there right next to each other, but there was a NSA listening post not too far away. We, meaning the United States, had nuclear weapons there, and nuclear weapons were not allowed on British territory, yet they were there. There was a lot of interesting things going on at those bases when this thing happened. And
also too, there had been reports of other weird phenomena before that particular incident back in 1980.
Right, and that's in the East Anglia part of the UK, and there, for whatever reason, there are lots of paranormal. There seems to be lots of paranormal activity in that part of the UK. During the 50s, they had what can only be described as almost like a bomber force of UFOs coming straight for the UK, and they sent up American Sabre jets, and they saw some fantastic things. But they were flying in a formation like a bomber formation, which really scared a lot of people because, of course, they thought they were the Russians at first, and then they send up these interceptors and they say, "No, these things are discs and they look like flying saucers," on and on. But for whatever reason, that part of the UK is haunted, or however you want to call it.
Would you say that? Okay, what would you say as far as your research and investigation goes is like one of the most bizarre accounts that you've heard?
Wow, good question. Because there's so
well,
many.
Of course.
The as far as UFOs, the whole history, and it went on for a decade, of UFOs showing up over our ICBM bases is just fascinating, because there were just so many witnesses and so much evidence that something was going on. UFOs would show up regularly over these ICBM launch pads, because these things are spread out all over the desert and all over the prairies. And they would fly over them, and they would shut them off. They would retarget them. They would do all these things, and a lot of people look at that as saying, well, once again, they're trying to protect us from ourselves. But I think it's more of a way of saying, we know what these things are, and we want you to know that, our technology is way better than yours. These things had happened in the Ukraine and Russia as well. But, the two stories that really stick out in my mind, they don't really have to do with flying saucers. They have to do with the ghost flyers of 1931 up in Scandinavia. People saw for about 6 months, way up near the Arctic Circle in Sweden, these very strange airplanes flying over. They were enormous. They had 8 engines, yet they had pontoons as if they were seaplanes. And they would do some strange things. They would circle these little villages, isolated villages, for hours at a time. They would fly in blizzards. They would do all these kind of very, very strange things. And then when the Air Force, or whatever the Swedish Air Force was like back then, went up to look for them, they would disappear. And then they just went away altogether. Those are the ghost flies. And then in 1946, in the same area of Sweden, they had the ghost rockets, where thousands of people saw these rockets going overhead in the summer of 1946. Some of them landed in lakes and then disappeared. Others were seen doing maneuvers. A Swedish pilot got up close to one, and his description is a description almost exactly of a modern-day cruise missile. They never found out where they came from. They just suddenly disappeared. Those two, the ghost flyers and the ghost rockets, above and beyond UFO sightings, are just fascinating mysteries to me.
Mm-hmm. You know what? Are you familiar with the? I think it's the World War I story of the angels, I believe, over France.
The angels of Mons, right?
Mons, yes.
It's it was a story that was carried in the British papers at the very beginning of World War I. There was a British expeditionary force that was small, and there's this enormous German force coming into Belgium that was going to basically invade France. The British smaller force at least delayed them. They didn't defeat them in this battle, but they delayed the advance. And later on, the story started circulating that the British had help from these heavenly archers, angels with bows and arrows, slaying the Germans. And then there was reports that, people saw German soldiers with arrows, sticking out of them and everything. A lot of it was laid to British intelligence, hoping to raise the morale of the British people at the time when World War I was going pretty badly. But, again, kind of a fascinating story. Yeah, it's called The Angels of Mons, Mons.
And there's another incident or case that's always intrigued me. It's about the battalion that disappeared into the fog bank.
Right, that happened in Turkey during Gallipoli.
Yes, Gallipoli. Invasion. Yes,
right. Where they would it was just one of these things where I don't want to disparage the British, but sometimes they were pretty crude in how they would send their forces into battle, basically just pouring more men into slaughter, and there was this one, brigade or a division of soldiers that once again had lots of witnesses around, because this is the height of a battle, a huge battle, and they just went into this smoke fog bank, whatever, and disappeared, and were never seen again. Now sometimes people are lost, blown up, and you're missing in action forever.
But what we're talking about, how many people in that brigade, though?
Boy, it was several hundred anyway, if I remember it right. It was a large number of people, and even the equivalent of the defense secretary, I guess you could call it, the British defense. Even he said, something very strange happened here. We can't figure it out. So, who knows? Who knows what happened? But very strange story, interesting story.
Yeah. There was a movie made on this a couple of years ago. I don't think it got very much airplay. I saw it on cable TV or something like that. Right. Here we go. All right, we'll be back for our last segment in just a few minutes. Tim Beckley and Tim Schwartz talking about the military and UFOs and Bigfoot and ghosts.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal. Your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Schwartz.
So here we are, Tim, at the bottom of the show. Just, less than a half hour left to go.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
And, I want to open this half hour for I guess, kind of a round robin here. We can throw our hats into the ring or our helmets, I guess, our military helmets into the ring and take it around the table. Let's start out with Jim with this question. Back in the early, late 1940s and early 1950s, there were a number of confrontations between the Air Force and UFOs. I mean, there was supposedly a shoot 'em down order, and we do know that Captain Thomas Mantell kind of disappeared off the radar over Kentucky after chasing a UFO, whether it was a legitimate UFO or a weather balloon or something along that line. Do you know in your research any confrontations similar to that?
I pretty much confine my interest to the state of Georgia. And there's nothing like that ever happened here. Although here at Robins Air Force Base in the late 40s and early 50s, there were 3 well-documented UFOs seen by Air Force officers, NCOs, and highly trained civilians who worked at the base. And there was no doubt in their mind that these things had occurred. And their reports were classified for 30 years.
And what were their reports?
They saw one time a cigar. And it seemed to be perhaps the same one that Childs and Whitted saw over Alabama, and they flew from Montgomery to Atlanta. And other UFOs, there was a bright spinning top, and these things would change directions. They moved up and down, and they would hover and then just disappear at tremendous speed. And they were all documented UFO cases over a major Air Force base.
Now, picked up on radar or just seen visually?
They were not detected on radar in those 3 cases.
Well, do you have an explanation for that? Because there are a lot of cases where these objects have not been picked up on radar, but yet we have credible eyewitnesses to these observations.
I have no idea why radar doesn't work on them. But there was one case when a fighter pilot was flying between Moody Air Force Base in Valdosta to the base airport at Fort Benning. He was halfway there when he saw a UFO above him, he was just accumulating flight hours. So he flew up towards it. It got bigger before moving away. Then he saw it was below him, and he descended. And about the time he called to the Fort Benning tower, the radar operator there said, "Did you see that thing that kept going up and down out there?" He said, "Yes, I was chasing it." In the end, Project Blue Book declared that he had been chasing Venus.
Venus. It's always Venus is the scapegoat of the of UFOs. I mean, even more so than swamp gas. I would.
Yeah, down
guess.
here, Jimmy Carter. That's what they say he saw.
Yeah. Well, now there's been a fellow who's been working on a movie about that Jimmy Carter incident, but it never came out. I mean, I've seen a trailer for it, but what most people don't realize, they say, "Oh, Jimmy Carter saw Venus. He was standing in front of the Lions meeting. They had just had a meeting, and they were sitting in front of the hall where they had just had their gathering." But there were other UFO sightings around that same time, within a couple of days of Jimmy Carter's sighting, including the landing of an object near the water tower right outside of town. So that case has not been investigated thoroughly. I was hoping that this film would come out and that we would see the evidence firsthand. And I think that Jimmy Carter has kind of been, his hand has been forced, and he's been made to say, "Oh, they say it's the planet. It was the planet Venus." Well, it wasn't the planet Venus all these years, but suddenly, I guess, pressure, not official pressure, but if maybe you just get tired of hearing people say Venus, 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 and decide, well, let me tell them it's Venus, because I don't want to sit here all day and argue with them about it. But Jimmy Carter's sighting, there's a lot more to it than we have been led to believe. And I sure in the heck wish that movie would come out. Also, too, there now I don't know if you fellas are familiar with this. There was an incident involving a helicopter that Jimmy Carter was on in Panama, where the helicopter he was on, taking him to the plane that would fly him back to, I guess, Air Force One, that would fly him back, was lifting up from the ground, and there were people scurrying around by the helicopter as it took off, and there in the sky is a UFO. Now, I had the photograph. It was in the newspaper, and I actually contacted the individual who took the picture down in Panama. It was I don't remember all the details. I've written it up, but it was a woman who worked there I think on the military base, and she swears the incident is true, and nobody's actually discredited it. And believe it or not, Grant Cameron found a copy of the photograph in the Jimmy Carter library, but there were no notes or anything with it at all. Well, I have the notes that I took at the time, but even more so than that, I remember around that period, I had gotten a letter from the Panama representative for the Mutual UFO Network, who had done an entire book on the on that particular incident, and they wanted me to publish it. And I didn't publish it, and I can't remember why I didn't publish it, but I don't even think I saw the manuscript, but it was supposedly ready to go, and I don't know who that person was, and I've never been able to track them down since then. So there's somebody in Panama who knows all about this incident, but I've never been able to track them down because I can't find my notes on the particular incident. But Mac, how about you now? Incidents where there have been actual battles between the military and UFOs?
Well, they're very rare. We have a story in UFOs in wartime about a confrontation between an F-16 fighter and a UFO during the first Gulf War. There are some, there's some evidence to it. There were some eyewitnesses to it on the ground. Once again, it was one of these things that it was just too good of a story not to put in the book. But I think it's more fascinating that, we don't have more of these stories, especially during World War II, when you have a lot of warplanes on both sides flying around up there and seeing these Foo Fighters in the middle of these battles and bombing missions and stuff. Yet there is not any recorded evidence at all that there was any kind of hostile intent on the part of the Foo Fighters. They were just there kind of watching us. As you said, in the 50s, there was a shoot first. The order to our fighter pilots, if they saw a UFO, this is after the UFO flap over Washington, D.C. in the early 50s. The order was that if you cannot contact the UFO, you should shoot it down. And when word of that got out, so many people called the White House and called the Pentagon, asking them, is this a good idea? Maybe you should, rethink this order. And they jammed up the phone lines so much, to the extent at the White House and the Pentagon that this is when the CIA got involved in the whole UFO mess, and they were the ones who started saying, well, look, why don't we just, bring in the ridicule factor here, and anyone who has any kind of credible UFO sightings, the best way to get rid of them is just basically say, well, you saw Venus, But again, it's fascinating to me that there aren't as many stories of us having, dogfights or any kind of battle with UFOs, especially during wartime, because they always seem to be up there when we're up there.
There was somebody, and I can't remember the guy's name now, who wrote a book a couple of years ago that it actually related back to the the Flatwoods Monster case.
Yes, Joe somebody, and I can't remember his name.
Yeah, but I mean, he went and took a look at the records, and around the same time that the Air Force had issued that shoot 'em down policy, there was a big increase of fighter jet crashes. And in fact, there had been, I guess, several incidents that had taken place shortly before the whole Flatwoods Monster case took place. And of course, his speculation is that, these pilots, were taking that shoot 'em down policy seriously, except they were the ones who ended up getting shot down.
Well, things like that could have happened. There are instances where our jet fighters have disappeared. There was a incident over Lake Michigan in the 50s where UFOs were seen coming over the border, and they launched a plane, an F-89 Scorpion. It was like this kind of very large jet fighter, and people watched on the radar as this fighter literally converged on the UFO. And they thought that, okay, they're going to circle it or whatever. But when the two radar points converged, they never separated again, and the plane was never found. The pilots' families were lied to, saying that they had crashed into the lake, Lake Michigan. Can't find the wreckage, so on and so forth. There are instances like that, and then the Mantell story, as you had referenced earlier, where he was in a P-51 Mustang. They call them F-51s then, and he flew way over the ceiling of that plane, chasing something. His last words were, it's enormous and it's shining bright or something like that. And then they found the wreckage of his plane, not 100 miles away, but quite a few miles away from where this incident happened. There are isolated cases like that. There's no doubt about it. But as far as major battles and so on and so forth, between our military, someone else's military, and UFOs, they're just not out there. And I find that in itself kind of fascinating.
I wanted to ask you real quick, Mac, and this is not UFO related, but it goes to a recent subject that you talked about on your Military X-Files. You were talking about weather as a weapon, and the attempts to use the military's attempts to use weather as a weapon, including killing thousands of enemy soldiers with directed lightning bolts. Now, I'm a big Tesla fan, and boy, that sure sounds like some kind of Tesla-like weapon.
Mm-hmm. Well, we had our most recent show. We talked about it because of the two hurricanes that just hit the United States. Weather research, weather as weapons research, of course, is classified top secret. The HARP up in Alaska, they know that when that was operating, at least under the military, they would throw, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of volts of electricity up into the ionosphere. Mm-hmm. Their excuse was that they were looking for ways to improve communications or something like that. If you could do it, if you could harness the weather, and one of the things that they tried to do is, one of our guests was talking about, is that if you could direct lightning bolts, or if you could create a thunderstorm that is especially electrified and have lightning bolts, if you can imagine that on a battlefield, in addition to the artillery and people shooting and bombing and everything, lightning bolts are coming down and hitting enemy soldiers. I mean, it's just such a scary scene to kind of contemplate. But of course, you have to think, well, how are you able to make sure that your own side isn't getting hit by these lightning bolts? How do you make directed lightning bolts? Supposedly they're working on it, but they work on a lot of things. And someone once said that 9 out of 10 secret projects never come to fruition. But they're looking into it, and as I'm sure the Russians and the Chinese are looking into it too. If you can harness the weather as a weapon, if you can direct a hurricane over your enemy's bases, or just as they're going into battle, or their fleets, something like that, you have more power in your hand than any kind of nuclear weaponry.
Well, I mean, considering the ability to be able to shoot lightning bolts, at an enemy, but you're absolutely right. I mean, how do you prevent then your own troops from becoming electrocuted?
Right.
Because I mean, we've seen these scenes where like a lightning bolt will hit, say, like a soccer field, and people will drop in all directions.
Right. Sure.
As the bolt grounds itself and then travels.
Not exactly the same thing, but the British some time ago they were going to start work on a nuclear bomb that when it exploded, let's say a tactical nuclear weapon, so a battlefield weapon, when it exploded, it was so bright that it had literally the ability to blind enemy soldiers. Okay, and people actually said, you know what? Yeah, that's almost not fair. That's not warfare. It certainly isn't in the Geneva Conventions. But they never developed it because they thought, well, once again, how do you prevent your own troops from, not going blind? And the fact that you would just blind thousands of enemy soldiers, it just didn't seem right in a way. So they never developed this particular weapon. But they were going to do it, and I suppose they could do it now if they wanted to. Just kind of a scary aspect of, another scary aspect of using nuclear weapons in war.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it's not fair. But then again, I mean, using poisonous gas or anthrax or things like that. Yeah, that's fair, too. Right. Well, Jim, I wanted to ask you about and when Tim Beckley was asking about, UFO crashes, or not crashes, but involved in the military and crashes. It made me think about this story that you have that took place in 1985 involving a crashed helicopter and Bigfoot. We're rapidly running out of time, unfortunately. So I'd like you to talk about that story just a little bit.
Yeah, it was a exercise by another state's National Guard. And it was a mountain ranger up in North Georgia in the mountains. And there were troops working on the ground, and then there were several helicopters. And one of the helicopters was swinging low and fast around the mountain and crashed and exploded as all the aviation fuel went off. And it killed the two-man crew. Now, the weird part started 10 years later, when somebody made a report to a Bigfoot organization. And they said, after that crash, I was an MP that was sent up there to guard the wreckage and guard the crew's bodies until morning. So he said they went up there, and there wasn't a lot to do. It got dark. They started a fire, and they were eating. And then they started hearing something from the crash site. It would sound like very large bodies moving around in there. So they illuminated their flashlights, and they saw what apparently was a Bigfoot family group. So like there was dad, mom, and a kid. And the distasteful part of the story is they were dragging away the bodies of the crew. The MP said they all drew their weapons and just fired until they were empty and reloaded and chased the Bigfoot away. And the next morning, they acted like nothing ever happened, and they went back to their base. And then a few years later, another man said, look, I was there. I was actual MP there. We reached the crash site. We helped load the bodies on a helicopter, and they left. And then we guarded the wreckage through the night, just sitting around, shooting the breeze and eating MREs, and there's nothing to the story. So it was an odd story, absolutely undocumented, and explained thoroughly.
And that supposedly, that took place where in Georgia?
It's near Dahlonega. It's up in the mountains.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a ranger base there. I can't recall the name of it. Maybe Camp Darby. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
all right.
You know, we are down to the last boot buckle here, and want to give both of our guests the opportunity to tell our multitude of listeners where and how they can be reached, and what they have available as far as books and literature and websites go. Jim, why don't you take it away first?
Okay, all of my books, a couple of Civil War books, but they're pretty much out of print now. But I have 2 Weird Georges and 3 Civil War ghost books and 3 books about Georgia ghosts, one story from every county, and the brand new Military Mysteries of Georgia. And you can write me at milesbooks@cox.net.
Okay, and you're on Facebook as well?
I'm on Facebook, yes.
Well, there you go. People will be flocking to your messenger there. And
that'd be nice.
Well, they do indeed, yes. And let us go to our next guest here. And Mac, why don't you tell us where people can reach you and find out about your literature?
Well, all my books are for sale in bookstores everywhere, but probably the best place to get them is on Amazon.com. The Wingman series, as you had mentioned before, 18 books. Also UFOs in Wartime, and Beyond Area 51, which is about secret bases around the world other than Area 51. We do a weekly show called Mac Maloney's Military X-Files that's heard on a wide range of networks.
Very good program.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
And people can contact me at wingman@macmaloney.com. Wingman@macmaloney.com.
Well, I want to thank the two of you for being on with us tonight. It was a fascinating discourse on strange phenomena and the military. And this is Sergeant Bunko. I'm going back to the barracks and make sure that everybody has gotten in shape to go out for our next Skywatch. Are you ready there, Private Schwartz?
I think so, Sergeant. But hey, we've got just a little bit more than a minute, and I think you should mention once again your new reprint that we just put out the other day.
Oh my goodness! This is the first book that I ever did to finance my early activities. 1962. It's Inside the Saucers: Confessions of a Teenage Ufologist. And it may sound a little hokey, but there's some darn good material in there. You would never guess that Jerry Clark and Alan Greenfield and all of us were teenagers at the time. And also, too, big news, Reverend Barry Downing has written a book, which is just available now. I think it'll be out tomorrow on It's an update of his Bible book that he did 48 years ago. It's called Biblical UFO Revelations. Did Extraterrestrials' Power Cause Ancient Miracles? And it should be up on Amazon tomorrow, Reverend Barry Downing. And once again, thank you, one and all.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.